All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Innovation Alchemy. My name is Adam Castle, and this is the podcast where we explore the mess, magic, and mastery of innovation and those bold enough to build big things. I'm joined today by a very special guest, a Windsor homecoming Danielle Gifford, who acts as the managing director for AI right now at PwC and has done a whole bunch of things. We're going to dive into it. Danielle, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be back.
Welcome home.
I know. It feels kind of crazy. It's been 8 years?
It feels like 8 years. Yeah. It feels like a decade. There was a pandemic in the middle of this as well, which is kind of insane. Yeah. And we're joined by some really special audience members today too. We've got, who do we have here?
We have my mom and my papa.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
There's a lot of pressure on me to make this good. And I don't know if I can live up to the hype, but we'll see.
We can do it.
Yeah. So we're going to start off. We're going to talk a lot about AI, a la your new role or your existing role right now. But you have done a ton since leaving Windsor. And I want to cover kind of the gamut of everything that you've experienced. So start with your resume. Where have you been and where are you now?
Yeah, for sure. So I would say most of my career has been spent working in early stage technology startups. I think that's where I really got into it here in Windsor, working for companies where we were doing augmented reality for the furniture industry or creating, cloud-based ERP systems, when cloud was novel, which seems a little bit crazy.
When people still thought the cloud literally meant up in the air.
Yeah, I know, in the sky. And then I actually kind of took a bit of a leap of faith around 8 years ago after the one company I was working for went under and moved out to Calgary. And it was kind of this thing where, I was curious about, West Coast and the mountains, but then I also knew that there was kind of something special happening in Calgary from a tech perspective. And so I took a bit of a leap of faith and, drove out to Calgary, didn't know a single soul, and started my MBA. And then at the same time, actually, while I was driving down, I got a call back from the guidance counselor who said, there's a position open at the Creative Destruction Lab. We're just launching Cedar Rockies. We think you'd be a really good fit. Cool. Yeah, based on your background working in early stage tech companies. And so it was kind of like the perfect landing spot because it was I wasn't really familiar with Calgary, and now all of a sudden I was in this innovation nexus between people who had founded, operated, and exited companies, and then capital providers, both on the non-dilutive as well as the venture capital side. And so it was kind of this move from, building, and then all of a sudden, helping companies try and build and scale across energy, agriculture, health, and fintech.
And the moment you entered in Calgary was the perfect time to do that jump. And so we have watched on this side of the country at this incredible growth that's happened over there, this transformation from, primarily energy to a whole bunch of different things, but also the intentionality around the municipal governments and around the provincial government there to really bolster this evolution. And it's something that we've held up as a model, but also just this incredible journey to kind of watch. And from your time from Windsor to working now at PwC, what do you see as some of those really big milestone turning point moments that have helped get you to today?
Yeah, I think definitely my time at the Creative Destruction Lab was a big one. And it was also my first foray into the energy industry, into utilities, into agriculture, and really seeing what it takes to scale, unique and novel technologies. And it was also really interesting because, similar to kind of the invention that's happening in Windsor right now, Calgary was going through this bit of a reinvention as well, where it's oil and gas prices might not be doing as well, but how do we kind of take some of that momentum and that energy and then filter it back into, the tech companies that we had. And so I think throughout maybe my last 8 years, I would say in Calgary, there's a couple kind of highlights that come to mind. One of them for sure is working at AltaML, so they're a machine learning and AI boutique consulting firm. And I was actually the lead of the Applied AI Lab. So it was Canada's first national AI kind of training academy, where we brought in those who had the foundations of machine learning and artificial intelligence. And then we worked, with large enterprises. So we worked with Suncor, TransAlta, ATB Financial, and then we actually scaled later with Microsoft, the University of Waterloo. We scored, with Rogers, with the Toronto Star. And so that, I think, was something that was really special and near and dear to my heart because, you know, it was kind of going from about 0 to 1, but at the same time, you know, being able to impact many lives of, you know, Canadians who are looking to kind of get into this space. And so that was really transformational. Another one I would say was the opportunity to work at Movement 51 and the 51, which was really at the time launching their second fund focused all around female entrepreneurs and female investors. And so, as you know, probably in your role, women are 51% of the population, yet only receive about 1.8% of venture capital. Like, it's almost like a rounding error. It's kind of frustrating. And so in that role, it was launching the programming to support founders who are looking to raise in a very practical way, understanding term sheets, understanding how to negotiate with those that they were raising from, how to hire their first key members, you know, how much equity to give them. And then the second part was for those who were looking to invest in early stage companies, because it's a bit of a tight-knit community. And if you don't know and understand that investing in these types of companies is something that you can do as with part of your wealth, although we talked about this, it's like the spicy part of your portfolio. You have to be willing to lose it all. But it's a really great way for people to, you know, support female entrepreneurs and also to create wealth at the same time.
Yeah, I remember witnessing on this side, you joining N51. And after you'd left, I had a meeting with Emily Smiley, who did the
new
spot.
executive. She's fantastic.
She's amazing, but she talked a lot about the shoes you left to fill. And just what was created there in that time. And I think there's a thread there because we've not crossed, well, I guess we've crossed paths, but not had direct overlap. So you spoke at Elevate the same year that I did. We didn't get a chance to connect, but I've talked to people that have worked with you in this process, and everywhere you've gone, that lasting impact that you've made has been like just tremendous. And so it's so cool to be able to kind of sit and talk full circle with you about that, because now there's that moment. And so I want to talk a little bit about, you know, you went through this moment in Calgary and in Edmonton as well, where it's really changing. The space is really changing. And as you noted, like Windsor is in that process as well. In the last 5 years, we've attracted $8 billion in investment here, all in this EV battery, new energy space. So much like what you're seeing in Western Canada as well. And so what we found is, having the forethought to create those types of shifts are one thing, but tapping into them after they've happened is another. How do you harness that? And that's something that I've seen Calgary do really, really well from like all different angles. And so I'm kind of curious of like, what does that look like today versus when you were starting, and what's the difference?
Well, I think it definitely goes back to that ecosystem approach and almost creating that flywheel. And something that we talked about earlier in kind of our conversation was just that, you know, both in Windsor and in Alberta, when you were graduating post-secondary, when you were graduating college, like you could immediately walk into a 6-figure job. And so when you can immediately do that, it kind of almost creates a bit of a vacuum and sucks the entrepreneurialism out, right? But when those industries, you know, start to have a little bit of headwinds or there's a little bit of turmoil there, then what happens with those people and where do they go? And, you know, do they go south of the border or do they reflect on, you know, their roots and what they know, which in both Windsor and both in Calgary is like building things, right? And being entrepreneurs. And so one of the things I found really interesting in my time in Calgary especially is, you know, when I was first starting at Creative Destruction Lab, in terms of incubators, it was like Startup Edmonton, which is now Edmonton Unlimited. And then there was Startup Calgary, which is now Platform Calgary. And then there was Creative Destruction Lab. And if you look and reflect on where Alberta is today in terms of its incubators and accelerators, there's Plug and Play, there's Thrive, there's 500 startups. But then you also have the influx from a venture capital perspective. So one thing that the Alberta government did that was, you know, really unique in its time is they stood up the Alberta Enterprise Corporation. And so essentially what it is it's funds of funds that attracts other VCs from across Canada to invest in, you know, Alberta companies, but also have boots on the ground. And so you have these companies that are being incubated, you have the capital that's specifically in the space, and then you also have things in terms of the tech talent that's there. So we had Benevity, we had Solium, we have Cement, and so there's starting to be more of an increase in that top tech talent in terms of machine learning developers, data scientists, product managers. And so as you start to get a little bit of this flywheel, and then you add on things that are happening at both the University of Alberta and University of Calgary, it really starts to kind of create this momentum and almost like this instead of like a normal kind of like pull, you know, and I think that that's been something that's been really great, I would say, for Alberta as a whole.
We talk a lot about creating a center of gravity for this stuff, where like there needs to be that center of gravity in order to start to attract these things. But I think oftentimes we think of a center of gravity as like one thing, a building, initiative, a program, but really it's everyone pulling in the same direction and working towards some common goal of like, we can achieve that. It's going to take a lot of work and it's something we need to work towards together.
Well, even if you look at like Opportunity Calgary Investment Fund, which was like a fund that was created by the city, both my roles at AltaML and Movement 51 had funding from there. Same thing with NRC IRAP, same thing with PrairieScan. And so like you said, it's not just one thing. It's a confluence of programs, people, and technology coming together that really creates that flywheel. And I feel like I have a lot of people in those organizations to thank as like part of the reason that I was able to kind of jump into my career.
That's awesome. So, okay, this isn't in our script.
I know.
This is me like fully nerding out. When you look at the way connectivity happens in Calgary, when it's between organizations or between funding bodies, how important has that been to the success of what's going on in terms of like free flowing information?
I would say the unique thing about Calgary that I've really witnessed and felt firsthand is the ability for people to open doors. So unlike some of the other ecosystems, and Windsor's not necessarily like this, but you know, like Toronto and BC that I've worked in, it's very elbows out. Whereas in Calgary, you know, if you have a conversation with someone, they're like, hey, you should really talk to, you know, someone from OSIF, or you should talk to someone from Luge Capital, for instance. And so there's a willingness to open doors and to connect people in, because it's the idea of, you know, let's build for the greater good, and like let's continue to like make Alberta, you know, this thriving powerhouse from an infrastructure perspective. And I think those things in terms of the connectivity, where, you know, it doesn't necessarily matter your experience or your level, but being able to kind of knock on some of those doors and those doors be open instead of having kind of this exclusive like elitist club makes a huge difference.
That's awesome. That's something that we've made a lot of strides in this ecosystem locally, but also across the province as well, is like treating the networks that we're a part of as the value itself. And it's tough, right? You have funders that are expecting things like jobs and investment and IP to come out of this work. But in our opinion, or my opinion personally, that's all a byproduct of connectivity. And it's all a byproduct of getting really good at moving entrepreneurs and founders to their next opportunity as quickly and painless as possible, without as much like red tape and muck in the way kind of thing.
Because you've seen a lot of growth here in Windsor, right? In terms of the programming, in terms of the investment.
Yeah, we've seen a ton in the last bit. And I'd say what we've seen a lot of is companies that are coming into this space with more of like fully formed teams and an understanding that Canadian technology isn't an overnight process. And so I think there's still this like, misconception out there that you're going to start your business tomorrow and the next day you're going to get funding and it's going to go global and it's going to be this phenomenon. Whereas like we're seeing companies that have been at this stuff for 8 years and they're getting really solid traction. They have to grow in a very different way from someone that was located in the valley. And so they're getting to be a lot more, I think, gritty about it, and thinking a lot more intentionally about how they want to build and how to be sustainable in that process, versus we're VC zombies and, there's a good chance that we're not going to make it out of, Series A type deal.
Totally. But we have lots of funding.
Yeah, exactly. but that, So we're seeing it. So I want to kind of shift into AI mode, because that's where you're living right now. But you were living there for a long time, or you've had this experience with it in early days, as you just mentioned. How did that help provide a foundation for where you are now?
Yeah, for sure. And it's interesting because you almost see people that are in the AI space like after ChatGPT, so after November of 2022, and then you've seen people that have been in the space for a while. So even when I was at the Creative Destruction Lab, one of the streams that I was running was our Prime stream, which focuses on a different variety of technologies across different industries. But at the core of a lot of those technologies, we're looking specifically at data, which then leverages itself to AI. And so being in that space at the Creative Destruction Lab, I feel like really gave me that foundation, especially because some of the streams that we're running in Toronto were specifically focused on AI. But when I had the opportunity to work with Corey at AltaML and really build the Applied AI Lab from just myself, and I remember him specifically being like, hey, we have some funding, like here's some papers, like, what do you think? How should we, grow this? Like, what does the team look like? That, I would say, is really where I got my foundation. And we were working with large enterprises, like Suncor, like TransAlta, like Spartan Controls, like ATB Financial, where we were going inside their organizations and working with some of their business leads and their stakeholders to identify, what would be good problem statements for artificial intelligence. And this was more of the traditional AI, so looking at more kind of predictive analytics. But that, I felt, really helped shape the baseline and the foundation, because it kind of put me in this unique role. And I feel like I've been in it for most of my career where, I know enough from a technical side to be dangerous, but then I'm also really great at working with the business and kind of building that connection, building the trust, and kind of building the empathy within. And so now when I look at my role specifically at PwC, where I support our team from an AI and advanced analytics perspective, where we're out in market, we're doing a range of things from, building and deploying, traditional AI, generative AI, and agents. But then we're also helping companies with how they think about their operating models. So how do you think maybe about a center of excellence, or do you have a hub and spoke model within your businesses? How do you make sure that you have the right governance around your organization, especially if you're in a heavily regulated industry, potentially like, utilities or like banking? And then how do you actually take the step to get your employees, onboarded and enrolled as they have these new types of tools, whether it be ChatGPT, Gemini, or Copilot? And how do you kind of give them that literacy and that fluency and that, almost psychological safety, where they can play with these new types of tools and they can, not only generate ideas, but then also kind of help from a productivity perspective. And so I think my foundation in my early days at Creative Destruction Lab and at AltaML really helped me to, be agile, be resilient, figure out the right people whenever I had questions. And now I kind of get to take that same type of entrepreneurial attitude inside PwC, where it's obviously a 9,000 person firm. And we have this kind of global community, but I get to build inside that with a pretty incredible team coast to coast. So yeah, it's a lot of fun.
That's amazing. And such like a full circle moment too. You've learned so much to kind of create that foundation. I'm curious, when we talk about AI, there's the hype of this moment and there's also like the real life application. And so what you're seeing, I think right now, is a lot of companies realizing that it may not live up to the hype of the moment, but it definitely serves a really unique purpose. And figuring out what that is very individualized for each business. We have a lot of startups that are creating products in AI that end up having to be bespoke because they have to change every single time they get into a new environment. Talk to me a little bit about that difference. What is the difference right now between the hype of the technology and the actual practical application of those tools, and where it's being used best, or where it's being most impactful in environments?
Yeah, so I'll talk about the impact part, but I think in order to understand the impact, you almost have to go back from like a macro perspective and look at where we are in almost this like AI sales cycle. Yep. And so if we think of what, a lot of the hyperscalers are saying out there, AI for everyone, people can use it, it's instant productivity, and you have it in your hands, and all of a sudden you're going to be able to solve so many more problems within your organization. And so when we're thinking about actual impact, that's not just isolated in these like skunk work, problems or areas. What we're seeing is organizations really kind of having this top-down approach where leadership says, and whether it's like a small to medium-sized business or a large enterprise, say that, AI is a priority for us. This is something that we're going to be focusing on. This is our approach as an organization, and you can be as far swinging as like, Toby Letke with Shopify to be like, hey, AI is now table stakes. It's in your benchmarks and your KPIs. Even if you want to hire, you have to prove that, someone can't do that job from an AI perspective. Or it can be like, this is something we're going to focus on. We're going to move slow to go fast. We're going to move with intentionality. And so having that voice and that direction of where you want to go is important. But then also within your organization is figuring out how you want to bring AI in. Do you build it and stand up your own capabilities from a data science and machine learning capacity? Now, larger organizations can do this because they already have a bit of that muscle. Do you buy it? There's, I think Gartner said in May of 2025, there's 1,000 platforms now that have some form of generative AI embedded. So do you buy that off the shelf like a Copilot, or within your Workday, or within, ServiceNow, or within SAP, or do you partner? And so like you were saying, for those more bespoke applications, do you mix a little bit of what you have from an organization perspective, and then do you partner with another organization that might have those skills and expertise? So I think it really depends when you're looking at that from an impact perspective. Now, most organizations that are having the best impact aren't just kind of taking this shotgun approach. They're focusing on what are the best, I don't want to say use cases, but problem statements in our organization. And do we focus on one area of the business first? So for instance, like supply chain, we always say is like very opportunity rich, right? And there's a lot of money that ebbs and flows. And if we look at some of the traditional challenges within supply chain, lots of vendors, lots of MSAs, money moving through, and you're checking these invoices very manually, spot checking, or you're doing it after the fact. It's a really great opportunity for traditional AI. And so organizations that are having the biggest impact are focusing on those areas, and then they're kind of taking this iterative approach to make sure that they're measuring what matters.
Really cool. And so from a perspective of measuring what matters, what are some of those very specific things that companies are doing really well when it comes to setting themselves up for a realistic ROI for this technology?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I could talk all day about this, but I remember I got a text message from one of my really good friends like 3 weeks ago. He's like, hey, Danielle, I won't mention his name or his company, but he's like, my boss is looking for a $200 million AI opportunity. Like, what are you seeing? And it's just like, it's not that simple, right? And so a lot of times we're seeing this disconnect between, maybe the board or maybe C-suite with what's actually happening from an operational perspective. And so in order to understand what areas will have the most impact, you have to figure out, is that potentially supply chain? Is that potentially within the field? Is that potentially within your back office, right? Because if we look at many back office functions, if we look at, even HR, most people get onboarded the same way. So can you create patterns? Can you create agents that can actually execute on some of those things? So from an ROI and impact perspective, we're seeing companies almost split it into two. One is the hard ROI, so looking at costs, looking at efficiency, and then hopefully most companies, what they want is, revenue increase. But then there's the soft benefits, or I kind of call them the squishy benefits, because I feel like soft always has like a negative connotation, like soft skills. But it's really like, what is your employee experience and what is your customer experience? And even it was just like Black Friday. And if we look at the experience that someone has, on Amazon, you go in and you click something and then you double click it and then all of a sudden it's going to be at your door tomorrow. So like that's what companies are competing with, right? And so you have to think about those two things together. You don't need to measure 87 things for one use case, but figure out those 2 to 3 KPIs that actually pull into your business strategy and map them back and focus on those things to decide if that use case will have actual value for you.
Really cool. When you talk about the soft stuff, I also see it as that's the differentiator too.
Yeah.
You can't compete with every other company that's on the internet and selling products. You can when it comes to the customer service side of it. And so how do you do that better? And sometimes I think smaller companies almost have that as a superpower.
I completely
where you're
agree.
so close to your customers that because you can ask them and have that feedback, really relatively quickly in real time. So
well, and smaller companies can also pivot quicker, right? Like if you think about a lot of your entrepreneurs that you're probably working with, and I laugh because like my fiance joined like a 3-person startup out of San Francisco, and I joined a 9,000 person global organization. But they're
in a tough dinner conversation. I'm like, oh yeah, well,
well, I faced this today. But it's interesting because their entire company is focusing on building AI native, right? They're leveraging Databricks, they're leveraging Cursor, they're doing code to cloud, and so they can pivot and grow in a much more conscientious way than sometimes larger companies where, especially if you're looking at things from an asset-heavy industry, like you weren't built thinking of innovation at its core, right? And so these smaller companies can kind of optimize for a lot of things right out of the bat or right out of the gate, whereas some of these larger companies, it's kind of like, remember when that company got stuck in the Suez Canal, the Evergreen or the Ever Given?
I'm still waiting on products.
Right? And then there's a little like lift that's trying to get it out of the canal and it's not working. And so it's really a process to shift some of these larger enterprises where they've just been doing the same thing the same way for decades.
I think that's a brilliant visual of the moment that we're in, where these companies that are so big are trying to adapt and trying to turn around in the canal, and it's just not always possible. And then I also think about this image of giant whale sharks in the ocean and those morays that suck around to the side of them and perform all of these really important things, but there's a partnership there's symbiosis. And so for a lot of what I do, it's trying to convince bigger entities to take a chance at these partnerships, because you're not going to be able to do do it on your own. You could try, but you're not as nimble as you need to be to move as fast as this technology is moving.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that in terms of how those partnerships are taking place and maybe stuff that you're doing at PwC that's helping to foster those types of relationships?
Specifically what I'm seeing, and I love the whale shark analogy because like in a former life, I wanted to be a marine biologist and study sharks.
Me too.
And now I'm a consultant.
Yeah, well, I want to be a paleontologist. It's a little bit different.
Yeah,
but
still
like
fun.
Dinosaur
right?
fish, same thing. Yeah.
What we're seeing for a lot of these larger organizations is that there's these kind of startups or these scale-ups that are coming and they're growing and they're adding in unique capabilities that these companies just necessarily can't do on their own. And so like you were saying, it's like they can perform a lot of those functions. They can support them from a scale perspective. And then it's not the company that has to worry about maintaining that, or they don't have to necessarily grow out that new capability. And so I would say a lot of the times with organizations, and I think where, Canadian organizations really struggle is that they don't trust, smaller companies or scale ups. Whereas if you look in the US, they're so competitive.
Yeah.
Everyone is eating their lunch and they're trying to figure out something that can kind of give them that next leg up.
You can't afford not to in that place.
Yeah.
Versus here where it's like, oh, they're going to sundown and then I'm left with the technology product that can't be serviced.
Well, and they won't, I find a lot of Canadian companies, especially larger enterprises, like won't necessarily take the risk or they won't even, look at that from an innovation perspective. Because like the first couple startups I was in, like we couldn't sell in Canada. Yeah. Like we sold primarily in the US. And I'm still finding it today, which is almost a little bit disheartening for a lot of companies, even companies that I work with in Alberta. One of my really good friends, Carrie, she is a managing director of an AI startup called Blue Marvel. And they specifically look at integrating, IoT sensors across different field assets and then providing those plant engineers with the information that they need. Now, for her to sell in Alberta has been so difficult, but guess what? She's gone to the United Emirates, and now she is, servicing 1/3 of one of the major oil companies' entire field.
Yeah.
But it's like, why do we have to go halfway around the world to be able to do something that's like our own bread and butter in our backyards? And so it's almost like larger companies need to think about the way that they integrate some of these newer technologies as well.
Yeah, almost thinking about how they're a part of these bigger global systems, which is competitive, versus the Canadian market, which there's fewer players in individual spaces. And so because you don't have these really crowded verticals, you don't have that competitive edge or drive to be like, well, we got to be different. Let's take some risk and invest in something different or new. I see that a lot. I see it even on the investment side of things too, which I think just speaks to a bigger cultural shift that we need to see. And we'll get into this like policy side of it. But what we kind of see is that companies that want investment oftentimes have to get a lead investor from someplace else in foreign dollars before they'll even be looked at by Canadians. Yeah. And so like I was at Northguide put on a really great global summit earlier this year, and you had 3 founders, and the story that they all told was, I couldn't get a Canadian investor in my business until I had USD as part of the lead investment stack.
Crazy.
And it's tough, right? Because it's like now is this moment where you're having a lot of national unity and a lot of talk about buy Canadian, and yet that isn't quite matching what's happening on the ground yet. And my hope is that we start to see that change in some big ways. And from a policy perspective, we start to see some tax exemptions or benefits for folks that are willing to invest in those spaces. But it's a slow process. It's a system that's been around, right? Like we're dealing with something that's been built over the last 120 plus years. How do you start to change that?
Yeah. And I feel like from an investment perspective, like everyone's first to be second.
Yes.
Like no one wants to. Well, I don't want to lead. I don't want to set the terms. And so it's, if you just like in like, if we look like Detroit is like right there, it's just such a different environment. And I think policy is definitely going to be really impactful and potentially like pushing some of those things forward. Like in Alberta, we used to have the Alberta Investor Tax Credit. So that was really big for us. But even if we think of what the new AI minister, Evan Solomon, has done and how he's kind of put together this 30-day council, and he's focusing on AI sovereignty, he's focusing on innovation, he's focusing on commercialization, and he's focusing on, how do we keep the best and brightest minds here in Canada? So it's like we're starting to see some good signals of things moving forward. But when does that kind of tipping point start to happen where, it pushes into that next era where we see the investment and like the technologies kind of stay?
I think it's a matter of sustainability. So the idea that we need consistency in this space, because it's such a large system and because it's been built so long, it's not something that's going to change overnight either. And so like keeping it, in mind that this needs to outlast political cycles.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter who's getting voted in. There still has to be this like really core foundation that we have of like Canadian technology should be on the table for Canadian companies. How do we make that more of a palatable kind of experience? So, we talked a little bit about our pre-interview conversation about policy. What do you kind of hope to see, or what are you encouraged by some of those key things that you're seeing come out of Ottawa right now?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really bullish on the signals that I've seen. I think it was in May when Evan Solomon, our new artificial intelligence minister, was announced. And then, you fast forward to September at the All-In conference in Montreal, he announces a 30-day task force. And it's not just filled with researchers. It's filled with practitioners. It's filled with leaders of, technology accelerators like Creative Destruction Lab. It's filled with those who are actually building the technologies as well. And this kind of next signal that we've seen is the federal budget come out, where there's around $960 million, give or take, dedicated towards AI sovereignty and AI innovation. And so some of those things I'm seeing, really make me excited around where the future is heading, not just from an AI perspective, but also from like a critical infrastructure perspective. Canadians are very good at building things, but we build them and then we like ship them and sell them and then we buy them back cheaper, right? And so how do we keep that inertia within Canada, and what does that specifically look like? And as we look as well to, some of our peers potentially in the EU, they've had the EU AI Act for about 2 to 3 years. They've started to kind of put it into practice. There's some really strong things around, AI literacy. So any company that is building, deploying, developing, or leveraging AI, they have a mandate that they have to actually train their employees. So I bet you will start to see some of those things actually come in from a Canadian perspective. And I also too, and don't quote me on this because I'm not an expert, but I saw this week that Canada now has an AI, I think it's an AI use case registry. So for federal government, any use cases that they're looking at are now going to go on this registry that I believe the public is going to be able to see. And it's the same thing that's happening in the EU as well. And so I think that these are all good signals towards the future and potentially towards what's to come. But I don't like to hold like bated breath, but it's always like, okay, signals are good, but like when do we actually start to see the impact?
Yeah, and that's always the question. I'd also argue that you are the foremost expert at this table in this space because you're not only working in it, but you're also teaching this stuff.
Yeah.
And so we can't really talk about the policy side of it, I think, without touching on some of the risks that we're seeing.
Yeah.
And so there's a prevalence out there of things like AI-induced psychosis, of things like, delusions that are happening with healthy users that are approaching these things. I want to talk a little bit about safety and ethics around this stuff, because I think it's just as important as the economics of it, in the idea that these things need to be in front of the light, because the more we talk about them, the more we can put in safeguards.
Yeah.
And even from a training perspective, right, you have all of your employees now using this new technology. Yeah. There should be this mental health component around it, because there is these risks, but there's also a ton of benefit. So let's talk a little bit about that in terms of what are you teaching on this?
Yeah, this is where I take off my consulting hat and put on my professor hat. I actually just wrapped up my second semester at the University of Calgary, where I'm teaching an AI and business course for their MBAs. But we talk a lot about AI safety, and we talk a lot about risk, and we talk a lot about trust. And, even if we look at one of our discussions just this past week, we focused on how in Australia, the government has officially banned any sort of social media accounts for kids that are under 16. So TikTok, X, if we're looking at LinkedIn, YouTube, now all of a sudden these children under 16 can't have access to these. And the illness isn't on the parents, it isn't on the students, it isn't on the providers, it isn't on the children, it's actually on the companies, and the fine is around $50 million. And I mention this because we're on this inflection point where we're seeing more content on the internet that's generated by AI than we are seeing human content. It's like 53% right now. And I don't know about you, but what I'm seeing on the internet is really hard to distinguish. Like if we look at Nano Banana, I was saying nano banana, but nano banana, which is, one of the new video models that are out there. Like, it's hard to tell what is real.
Nearly impossible unless you're looking very closely at this stuff. Yeah.
And so, for instance, in China, they have a specific rule where any content that's generated from an AI perspective has to have a watermark on it, or it has to have some sort of big statement that shares with the users that this was generated, or, enhanced leveraging AI. Yeah. But if we look at the other things that you're mentioning around AI psychosis, or even like cognitive atrophy, which is this idea that, are we becoming too reliant on these AI models, and are we all of a sudden outsourcing our thinking and losing that kind of, frontal cortex that we need in order to make decisions? And the stats are a little bit alarming if we look at what's coming out from MIT, where, people are offloading, whether it be summarizing, whether it be generating, whether it be, for students in particular, coming up with a paper, to these models. And so are we losing our ability to think in a certain way and to kind of have that muscle to critically evaluate? And I thought it was really funny because as I was going through and I was prepping for class, I was a little bit behind, as I normally am. But I was like, okay, I'll just throw these 3 articles into, ChatGPT or Perplexity, and I'll get it to summarize it and come up with some ideas of slides. And I was like, oh my God, I'm literally doing this, right? Because I'm like, I'm short on time. It can read it, and then I'll get, what are the key benefits out of it, right? And so cognitive atrophy is really real. I think we're seeing it a lot, especially in students that are younger. In elementary school, there's lots more evidence out there showing that they have a lot of self-doubt. They have lower confidence. They'd rather ask the model what makes the most sense rather than rely on themselves, which goes back to this idea of AI psychosis, and where these models have this, sycophancy?
Yeah.
Where they just tell you what you want to hear, right?
And
they
a lot
tell
of validation of those ideas.
You're great, and this is a really good idea. Right? And so there's this kind of delusion behavior that's happening. And if we don't have these safeguards in place, it's also leading to more extreme effects, where we're seeing cases, unfortunately, of, people taking their own lives. Yeah. And we're seeing these models prompt them to not talk to their parents. And so I kind of feel like, and this is a conversation in class where we have like the pursuit of profit over safety. Yep. Right? And so how do we make sure that we protect our most vulnerable populations, our children, and then our elderly, while at the same time, potentially having these benefits of these systems where AlphaFold, was able to generate over 200 different protein structures. So we're going to be able to solve diseases way quicker, right? Yes. So it's like this balance, but when sometimes the balance is driven more by like shareholder value, it causes like a huge angst, I would say, in many people, because they don't necessarily know that they're a bit of the guinea pigs. And like, even for me,
because it's so
nervous.
New, right? Like, it's a brand new technology. I think about other tech too, where you look at vehicles, or like there's inherent risks with everything that we've created, and at the same time, incredible benefits, right? Like, that economic mobility is such an important thing in the world that we live in our society today. I don't think anyone would say, well, I'm never going to drive a car because I might get into an accident. Yeah. And so it's really about putting, you take driving lessons in order to do that. That isn't something that we have yet for AI. And I think as we start to develop out a better understanding of where the risks lie, we can start to build better frameworks for how to avoid those pitfalls. And I think some of it has to be on the companies, and that comes down to a policy perspective, where if you know that you have a sycophantic model that is creating tons of validation and creating this environment for it, you want to make sure that these things can be and should be really great sparring partners for ideas. Yeah. And so what I would ask you then, I think, is what are some of the safeguards that you put into place when you're using these models? Do you have specific prompts that you have at the ready that create a little bit more of almost like a diversity of thought within these spaces?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would say I love to use like a collage approach when I'm creating my prompts, which essentially means, I put in the role, I put in the action, I put in the context, and then I put in, specific examples. But what I always kind of put in my prompts is like, if you don't know the information, like, don't make it up. If you're finding certain sources, like, make sure that you're actually adding those sources in. And what I often find more than anything is I really like to have it as a thought partner, whether it's, coming up with new ideas from a classroom perspective, or if I'm going into, a meeting with, a CFO or CIO of a company, and I want to understand their business a little bit better, and I'm looking at these AI use cases, and then I also want to understand what their competitors are doing, like almost kind of going through it from that perspective. So having it as a bit of an assistant or creative thought partner is where I like to use it. But what I've also found is I've really tried to like slow down on the like summarization or the like analyze, right? And just go, can I take the 10 minutes that it takes to read this and go through and like line by line, and like this isn't great, but like I love printed stuff. Like I'm still handwritten notes, handwritten everything, but can I go through and just like read that so I make sure that I'm not losing any of that critical thinking skills? And that kind of like always like you trust, but you have to verify.
Yeah, there has to be that process where like you continue to be a layer, I think, between the output and I've even taken to...
Yeah, what are you doing?
So there's like easy ways to go about, like our life is, our job is a lot of emails, it's a lot of connectivity, it's a lot of meetings. And so I use it as an AI note taker, which has been phenomenal. But what I do, and I started a blog last year, and what I do is I'll use Otter specifically to record my meetings. And then I'll ask it to think about or give me some of the bigger themes that it's heard me talk about. And then I'll help to like synthesize that into larger learnings for myself. And so there's little moments there, or I use it a lot as an ability to check myself. So I'll ask like, how much did I talk in that conversation with the client? Like, was it too much? Did I give them space? Did I ask enough open-ended questions? Like, give me a rating.
Coaching.
And so I kind of have a report card for myself that I use to make sure that I'm always listening actively and building on what they're saying and not jumping in with solutions before thinking about what the actual problem is. And I find that really helpful. But I also find too that I think we're going to see a course correction. Eventually, when everyone is using AI to create every piece of content that they put out there, the internet is all AI content. We're going to have this like reversal of like, wait,
paying a premium
where's
for human.
The people out of here? And I know we're starting to see that in some industries where you can have, an AI customer service rep, or you can actually pay for the real person. And I think, we're going to see eventually a course correction around how much it's used. I'm paid in my job to communicate. And so if I'm using AI to write an email for me, what's the real value that I'm putting out there, right? Or like, are they expecting to see more of me in those communications? And so I'm very careful around and sparingly around how you use it. And a lot of like, help me pressure test this idea, but I need to write it out. And sometimes I always think about like, if there's a spelling mistake in something, like it means I'm human. It's okay. I'd rather a spelling mistake.
Like, oh, that's Danielle.
Yeah, exactly. That's
her. Definitely.
Yeah, or like run on sentence. That's Adam for sure. Yeah. There's way too many commas in that. So, so I do look to that as like, there has to be some balance. And to make sure that you're still critically thinking about the stuff that you're putting out there.
Well, and I think it goes back to like this technology, like GPT, it's like a general purpose technology. So you can use it across everything. You can use it if you are like 5 years old. You can use it if you're 100 years old. And so almost as if like when the internet first came out, there's almost going to be hopefully this like regulation back towards like norms and who's using it for what. But I also think a lot of that comes back to literacy and training. And I know in Alberta, we have the Alberta Machine Learning Institute, AMI, and they've received a lot of, provincial and federal funding to support on that specifically. Support teachers K through 12 on, integrating AI, learning from like the very basic levels to more advanced levels, and supporting, students in the classroom as well as teachers, because like teachers are a front line and they need support more than ever on what they, should be doing. And this isn't like going into Google and just searching for something and it's all SEO, right? It's a large language model and it's trained on God knows what, depending on what model you're using. So you want to make sure that you know and understand how to interact with it to get out what you need.
We've got, so we have Vector in Toronto.
Vector and
that does a lot. And we had Jeffrey Hinton, who came out of University of Toronto, right, which is the godfather, one of this technology and neural networks. And he talks a lot about what the shifts are and how you're seeing it being used. And something that I've seen really interesting in the last little bit is that Gen AI it's just a phase in this process. And what you're actually seeing is like the future user interface to most technology. So the idea that Gen AI is wonderful as it is, but it's not particularly useful right now. It can write our emails, it can summarize things, that's great, but as the front end of a lot of systems, it becomes this other thing, which is this really simple way to talk to technology to get what you need out of it without having to over-explain yourself, or having it be intuitive enough to kind of know what you're trying to get, versus clicking a million things. You're asking it something very specifically.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious, like, do you see that as a bit of a transformation in the future of more so it's the UI layer to the technology that we're using?
Yeah, I think if in very like specific use cases, so for instance, like there's tools out there like Harvey AI, which is specifically just focused on serving legal professionals. So the model is trained on legal research, documentation, court cases, and it has the right guardrails and information around it. So I find that model or that application in particular is much more helpful for the audience it serves specifically. When you're looking at a Copilot or a ChatGPT more broadly, you might not necessarily always kind of get out what you want. But the other thing that I would say is that if you look at what some of the larger data companies are doing, so for instance, Databricks, they have a new tool called Genie. And so essentially what you can do is you can put Genie on top of a lot of your different databases and Unity Catalog, and you can query Genie to come up with information or insights about the data that's there. Okay. And a lot of large organizations, and I think specifically even if I look at utilities companies, you have disparate data sets that aren't, connected, or they're not interoperable. And so you have your AMS data, you have your SCADA data, you have your potentially MDMS data that's coming in, right? You have your pairs data that's coming in. And so if you can have, a smart agent or a smart assistant on top of that to query information without having to go in and understand all of the different fields, understand all the tables, understand all the logic that got it from bronze, silver to this gold data set, that's where I think a lot of the value is going to come from. But then it becomes a data problem. Right. Because a lot of times data is just not where it should be. So as fast as companies want to move on the AI, generative AI and agent side, like you still need to make sure that you have your basic data fundamentals or even your processes in place. And so it's almost like people aspire to be here, but yet don't have kind of some of the back of the house, figured out yet. And so do you need to have the entire back of the house figured out before you can get there, or do you kind of simultaneously like work on both in parallel to get where you need to be?
There's kind of two schools of thought, right? Like there's the AI that empowers the individual worker to be better, productivity, or there's the AI that sits underneath all of the functions of an organization and helps people get that information much quicker. So it's not actually affecting my day-to-day job outside of giving me what I need that much faster, but it isn't changing how I do that work. And we see a lot right now, I think, of people looking at AI as just the top layer, is just the superhuman powers that I can write an email in 14 seconds flat, regardless of how many M dashes are in it, and I'm not going to look at it. But where we're seeing a ton of the value that actually drives this technology forward is the slow work, is making sure that all of your data is segmented properly and in the proper format in order for it to be read and synthesized.
Well, and the other thing from a productivity perspective is like, okay, so Adam and Danielle can write their emails more quickly and summarize documents and, yada, yada. So Adam and Danielle maybe get half an hour back in their day. What do you do with that half an hour? Do you go walk your dog? Do you have an extended lunch? Or are you more prominent in front of clients, right? In terms of your role, what's going on there.
The cognitive surplus that you're given then,
so it's like the day-to-day productivity, and then the shift to like using AI to transform the way you deliver, and then like the final shift, which is using or leveraging the technology to, potentially diversify your revenue streams, right? Or generate net new revenue is like kind of where we're seeing it. But from a basic productivity perspective, it's like, okay, so then what?
Of course.
Right? If I'm saving 6 minutes on every task, fantastic. But did I also make maybe an extra like couple $1 million? Well, I don't know, right?
Yeah, it's very interesting. I think what's cool is, and we talked about this, we're so in the middle of this shift.
I know, it's fun
and
time.
It's happening much faster than it happened with the internet. It happened with previous technologies, where adoption, you've never seen an app grow at the same speed as OpenAI. That technology
800
adoption,
million
it's
users weekly. Grok has 400 million users. It's like over 1/8 of the population.
Ridiculous. Yeah. And now it's like it's embedded into every technology that you're using, whether or not you want it or you're aware of it. Yeah. It's there anyways. And so it's just happened so quick, and now we're kind of reacting and adjusting to it. I want to shift because I'm recognizing the time. We blew through this hour really fast.
I was thinking we were going to.
I want to talk about impact. You've done so much. But I want to focus on like, what are you really proud of? This is a cool full circle moment. The last time you and I sat down together, you lived here, you were about to move to Calgary. And so where do you kind of see your impact being the biggest in the last little while?
Yeah, I would say I always think about impact very much from like a people lens. And I would say at my roles at, Creative Destruction Lab, Movement 51, and AltML, and even at the university, like I've really had the opportunity to work with, these cohorts of founders, of investors, or of students. And like, I know for me, even when I was doing my school, like I had a couple of professors or people that were in my like sphere of influence that really were like the catalyst to change the way that, I decided things, or to like figure out what kind of journey that I wanted to be on. And so from an impact perspective, I feel really grateful and like extremely lucky to have been in some of those positions to support people along, their journeys, and been a bit of a sounding board and, creating a space for them to like truly reach their fullest potential. And so I would say that has been very fulfilling. And like, that's why, not that I have time to teach or to be on boards or to do these other things, but like, I would say that that's why I continue to do that, is like, it's not about titles. Like, it's about like, how can you impact the next generation or support someone that's kind of going through like a massive change in their business or from an investing perspective.
That's awesome. It's really cool perspective to have when you're in this 9,000 person team now. But it really still is about impacting the individual person and helping them through that. You used a line when we had our pre-interview, which was buying a gym membership is not the same thing as equating to fitness. We're talking about how adoption of technology happens, in that, sure, people can invest in this technology, but unless you're using it, applying yourself, putting in the reps to make it worth it, you're not going to get out what you're looking for. I'm curious, you've worked with so many companies on tech adoption. What is like one key takeaway for the listeners that they can kind of lean on when looking to adopt new technologies and wading into these waters that might be a little bit scary?
Yeah, I would say for anyone that is listening, focus on your people. I think people often get missed. They're almost like the check mark at the end. And you can have this amazing, incredible, sexy technology that you put in. But I would say technology moves at the speed of innovation, and adoption moves at the speed of trust. So if your people don't have trust in the systems that you're now giving them, if they don't have trust in the systems that you've built for them, if they were not actually part of that process, then no matter what you put in front of them, they're not necessarily going to adopt it. And so I often see, really great technologies that are rolled out, but the buy-in was never there, from the beginning. And so if you're not bringing your people into the fold, and like we talk about and joke about it, like people are tired, like change fatigue is a real thing, right? And so like managing your expectations on people and making sure they're there from the forefront is like a big differentiator. And I know even at PwC, like our thesis when we rolled out Copilot to 9,000 people, like it wasn't led by the tech team. It was led by our workforce team. Because the idea was that we need to put people at the core and the center of all of this, rather than just be like, here's another license for you to like play around with. So people would definitely be where I would say to focus.
I think that's absolutely brilliant. And I would agree too. I think it's the foundation of everything. And the minute you start forgetting that, or you start putting things like profit ahead of that, you really get yourself into some sticky waters. And I think it's interesting because you can see right now all of these large corporations choosing profit over people. They're, downsizing their workforces. They're limiting the manager layer right across Silicon Valley right now. And I think what we're going to see over time is there needs to be a course correction to that type of behavior, because if we don't have people powering the products, we're not going to have people buying those products either. And so I think it's something that we're going to see start to really rapidly evolve over the next little bit.
I very much agree.
So I want to talk finally about direction, because you're doing things like teaching and working at PwC and consulting and in venture partnership and on boards. How does that all create kind of what comes next for you? And where do you see yourself when we sit down for this conversation again in the next 10 years?
Yeah. I remember when I was reading our script at the end, and I was going through that, and I was like, well, where do I see myself in the next 10 years? And I would say it's definitely not about titles. Like, I really just want to be in a role where I am challenged in the right ways. I'm surrounded by people that are way smarter than me, so I continue to learn, and that I'm making an impact, whether that be with people, whether that be with organizations, whether that be with an investment perspective. And I want within that kind of confluence of things just to be happy, you know, where it's like, it doesn't matter how much money you make. It doesn't matter what title you have. It's more around the impact that you're actually having at the end of the day that I think will make the big difference. That's anyways what motivates me from my perspective and what I've seen, and like still having the time to, like, you were joking about, you know, going to see the symphony and like Elsa on Broadway, right? Like still having that time with your family and, you know, the people that matter most. And so in 10 years, I mean, I have no idea. I mean, hopefully I'm somewhere warm, but like in 10 years, I have no idea where I'll be. But if I have kind of those core pillars in my life, I feel like I'll be pretty happy.
I love that. I want to clarify, I'm not taking myself to Elsa or Frozen on Broadway.
You can tell everyone.
For my 3-year-old daughter, that's fine. No, I think when I think about leadership and what I've learned in the last like 13 years of my career, leadership is not about those titles. It's about showing up and being consistent and making sure that the people around you are feeling taken care of and considered. And so when I think about you, I think about a really phenomenal leader that regardless of what title you fall into, you're going to continue to do that. And so I'm very excited to continue watching it. And thank you so much for your time today. And I greatly appreciate our friendship.
Yeah, thank you so much for the conversation. It was nice to sit back down. I feel like this was a great homecoming.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, anytime, we're here. So thank you.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Awesome. All right. Until next time, we'll see ya.